The zone around Chernobyl was an enigma: abandoned buildings, overgrown streets, and an unnatural stillness cloaked in whispers of the past. Stalkers ventured into its heart seeking relics, wealth, or answers. But the zone had its own rules, and those who entered often faced more than they bargained for. Part 1. Dmitri adjusted his gas mask as the crumbling skyline of Pripyat came into view, the skeletal remains of the Ferris wheel looming against a gray, overcast sky. His companion, Alexei, trudged beside him, their boots crunching against the cracked asphalt littered with debris. They weren't the first to explore the abandoned city, but they hoped to uncover something new, a hidden cache, valuable artifacts, or perhaps a truth that had eluded others. "Why do we keep coming back here, Dima?" Alexei asked, his voice muffled by the mask. "It's not like the zone's ever been kind to anyone." Dmitri chuckled, though his eyes remained wary. "Because it calls to us. And because there's something out here worth finding." The zone had a reputation: mysterious phenomena, strange anomalies, and whispers of things not entirely human. Stalkers like Dmitri and Alexei braved it all for the chance at a prize. For Dmitri, it was more than treasure. The zone fascinated him, its unnatural beauty and hidden horrors pulling him deeper every time. As they approached Pripyat, the wind shifted, carrying with it a low hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath their feet. Alexei stopped, glancing around nervously. "You hear that?" Dmitri nodded. "Probably just an anomaly. Stay close." The buildings around them were crumbling, overtaken by nature's relentless march. Trees grew through broken windows, vines wrapped around rusting playground equipment, and puddles of stagnant water reflected the dull, gray sky. But the quiet was unnerving, the kind of silence that pressed down on you, making you feel like you weren't alone. Their destination was the Azure Swimming Pool, a landmark in Pripyat that other stalkers had described as haunted. Rumors spoke of ghostly lights, strange apparitions, and an energy that seemed to pulse within the cracked tiles of the abandoned pool. "Why the pool?" Alexei asked, his voice tight. Dmitri scanned the area, his flashlight cutting through the dim light filtering through the overcast sky. "It's where they said the artifact was found, the resonance. Supposedly, it amplifies the presence of anomalies. If we find traces of it, we might uncover something bigger." The two entered the building, the smell of mildew and decay assaulting their senses. Inside, the pool lay empty, its tiles cracked and stained, but the silence felt heavier here. Dmitri's Geiger counter ticked faintly, a reminder that radiation was ever present, though manageable for now. As they moved deeper into the building, Alexei shone his flashlight on the walls, revealing faded murals of swimmers and cheerful scenes from a long-lost era. "Hard to believe this place was once filled with life," he muttered. Dmitri stopped abruptly, his light catching on something glinting near the far edge of the pool. He approached cautiously, his steps echoing in the cavernous space. It was a metal object, partially buried under debris. He knelt to examine it, brushing away the dirt and rubble. It was a piece of machinery, strange and unrecognizable, covered in symbols he didn't recognize. "What is it?" Alexei asked, peering over his shoulder. Dmitri shook his head. "Not sure. But it's not from the Soviet era, that's for sure." Before they could investigate further, the low hum they'd heard earlier returned, louder now, vibrating through the floor. The air grew thick, shimmering like heat waves, and a faint glow began to emanate from the center of the pool. "Anomaly!" Alexei shouted, stepping back. "We need to get out of here." But Dmitri hesitated, transfixed by the glow. It pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat, and as he stared, he felt a strange pull, as if the anomaly were calling to him. The glow intensified, and shapes began to form within it, shadowy figures that flickered in and out of existence, their outlines distorted. "Dima!" Alexei grabbed his arm, snapping him out of his trance. "Move!" They ran, the hum growing deafening as the anomaly surged, releasing a wave of energy that rattled the building. Debris fell around them as they bolted out of the pool area, the glow still visible from the corner of their eyes. Once outside, they stopped to catch their breath, the hum fading into silence behind them. Dmitri looked back at the building, his chest heaving. "It's not just an anomaly," he said, his voice trembling. It's something more. Alexei's eyes widened. You're not seriously thinking about going back, are you? Dmitri nodded, his mind racing. We have to. Whatever's in there, it's connected to the zone itself. This could be the key to understanding everything. Alexei shook his head. You're insane. That thing could have killed us. But Dmitri couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of discovering something monumental. The shadows, the hum, the artifact, it was all connected, and he was determined to find out how. For now, they retreated to their makeshift camp on the outskirts of Pripyat, their minds heavy with questions. As night fell, the zone seemed to come alive, the distant glow of anomalies flickering like fireflies in the darkness. Dmitri stared into the distance, the hum still echoing in his ears. Whatever they had encountered in the pool was no ordinary anomaly. And it wasn't done with them yet. Part 2. The campfire crackled weakly against the cold night air, casting long, wavering shadows over the tattered tents and makeshift gear. Dmitri sat on a rusted metal crate, his gaze fixed on the distant skyline of Pripyat. Even from here, the zone pulsed with its strange energy, the occasional flicker of distant anomalies lighting up the abandoned buildings like ghostly lanterns. You're not seriously thinking about going back, are you? Alexei asked, breaking the silence. He leaned against a tree, his rifle balanced across his knees, but his expression was tense. We barely got out of there alive. Dmitri ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, his eyes still distant. We have to, Alexei. There's something there. Something bigger than we've ever found before. Alexei exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You're obsessed, you know that? Whatever's in that pool isn't just an anomaly, it's dangerous. And I'm not about to get fried or worse because you've got some itch to scratch. Dmitri turned to him, his expression resolute. You felt it too, didn't you? That pull, like it was calling to us. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just random. It wanted us to find it. Alexei didn't respond, but the flicker of fear in his eyes said enough. The zone was known for its mysteries, but this felt different. The glow, the hum, the shadowy figures, they weren't just phenomena. They were intentional. After a tense silence, Alexei sighed, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Fine. But if things go sideways, we're out. No second chances. Dmitri nodded, his lips curving into a faint, determined smile. Deal. At dawn, they packed their gear and set out for Pripyat again, the city's decaying ruins looming larger with each step. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional distant echo of falling debris or the rustle of wildlife reclaiming the area. The air felt heavier today, charged with an unexplainable tension that made every sound seem amplified. When they reached the azure swimming pool, they paused at the entrance. The building seemed different somehow, as if it had shifted overnight. The windows were darker, the structure sagging slightly, and a faint, rhythmic vibration emanated from within, barely audible but unmistakable. Still time to turn back, Alexei muttered, but Dmitri was already moving forward, his flashlight slicing through the dim interior. Inside, the air was thick, almost tangible, and the Geiger counter ticked softly, a steady reminder of the zone's omnipresent danger. They retraced their steps to the pool, the faint hum growing louder with every step. As they entered the pool area, the glow returned, emanating from the same spot in the center. But this time, the light was brighter, more defined. Shapes began to form within it, shadowy figures that moved with a strange, fluid grace. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. Their forms flickered, as if caught between dimensions, their movements deliberate and purposeful. Alexei froze, gripping his rifle tightly. What the hell are those things? Dmitri didn't answer. He stepped closer, transfixed by the glow. The figures didn't seem hostile, but their presence was unnerving, their hollow faces turning toward the two stalkers as if acknowledging their arrival. Dima, get back! Alexei hissed, his voice rising with panic. We don't know what they are. But Dmitri ignored him, his curiosity overpowering his fear. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the strange artifact they found the day before, the piece of machinery with the unfamiliar symbols. As soon as he held it up, the figures reacted, their movements becoming more erratic, their forms shifting and distorting. The hum intensified, vibrating through the floor and walls. The glow pulsed, and the air around them seemed to warp, bending the light and sound. Dmitri felt a sudden pressure in his chest, as if the zone itself were pressing down on him. "Stop!" Alexei shouted, grabbing Dmitri's arm and pulling him back. "You're going to set something off." Before they could retreat, the glow erupted into a blinding flash, and a wave of energy surged through the room. Both men were thrown backward, landing hard on the cracked tiles. The light dimmed, and the shadowy figures began to coalesce into a single shape, larger and more defined. The figure stood in the center of the pool, towering over them, its form still flickering but more solid. Its hollow eyes locked onto Dmitri, and for a moment everything went silent. Then, a deep, resonant voice echoed through the space, not from the figure itself, but from everywhere at once. "Why, have you come?" Dmitri struggled to his feet, his heart racing. We want to understand. To know what the zone is." The figure tilted its head, its form shifting slightly. "The zone is balance, life, and ruin. Your kind disrupts." Alexei scrambled to his feet, his rifle aimed at the figure. "What do you mean disrupts? We haven't done anything." The figure turned its gaze to Alexei, its hollow eyes piercing. "You seek what you cannot comprehend. The zone takes what it is owed." Dmitri felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you want from us?" The figure paused, its form flickering again. "Restore balance. The artifact must return, or the zone will consume." Dmitri glanced at the object in his hand, its strange symbols glowing faintly. He understood now, this wasn't just a relic. It was part of something larger, something that maintained the fragile equilibrium of the zone. By removing it, they had disturbed that balance, and the consequences were already unfolding. "All right," Dmitri said, his voice steady. "We'll return it. Tell us where." The figure raised a hand, pointing to the far side of the pool, where a faint, shimmering portal had appeared, rippling like water. "Through the gate. Restore and leave." Alexei hesitated, his grip on the rifle tightening. "How do we know this isn't a trap?" Dmitri shook his head. "We don't. But we don't have a choice." Without waiting for a response, he approached the portal, the artifact clutched tightly in his hand. The glow intensified as he stepped closer, the air around him growing colder. He glanced back at Alexei, who nodded reluctantly, and together they stepped into the unknown. As they passed through the portal, the world around them shifted, and they found themselves in a place unlike anything they had ever seen. The sky was a swirling vortex of light and shadow, the ground a mosaic of fractured earth and crystalline structures. In the distance, a pulsing orb of energy hovered, its light both beautiful and terrifying. "This is it," Dmitri murmured. "This is what the zone is hiding." But the question remained, could they restore the artifact and escape with their lives? Part 3. Dmitri and Alexei stood in stunned silence, their breaths clouding in the cold, alien air. The landscape before them defied explanation. Shimmering crystals jutted out of the ground like frozen waves, and the sky was a swirling chaos of light and shadow, pulsing in rhythm with the distant orb of energy. "This doesn't look like any part of the zone I've seen before," Alexei muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. "What is this place?" Dmitri held the artifact in his hands, its faint glow matching the pulsing rhythm of the orb. "It's another layer. Like the zone's heart or its core." Alexei raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me we're inside the zone now? What does that even mean?" Before Dmitri could respond, the ground beneath them trembled, and the air around them seemed to thicken. The artifact's glow intensified, and the distant orb flared brighter, sending ripples through the strange terrain. Shadows moved in the periphery of their vision, shifting unnaturally, as though the zone itself were watching them. "We need to move," Dmitri said, his voice tense. "The orb, it's where this thing belongs." The path toward the orb was jagged and uneven, the crystalline formations jutting out like teeth. As they made their way forward, the pulsing hum grew louder, reverberating in their chests. The shadows around them grew more defined, coalescing into humanoid forms that flickered in and out of existence. Alexei raised his rifle, his eyes darting nervously. They're back. The shadows from the pool. Dmitri stopped, staring at the figures. They didn't move closer, but their presence was undeniable. They're not attacking, he said slowly. I think they're guardians. Guardians of what? Alexei snapped. This whole place is a nightmare. The zone, Dmitri replied. They're here to make sure we don't upset the balance again. The shadows continued to follow them as they approached the orb, their flickering forms growing more defined with each step. The orb itself was enormous, radiating light and energy that seemed to pulse in sync with the artifact in Dmitri's hands. It floated above a pedestal of jagged crystals, its surface shifting and rippling like liquid fire. Dmitri stopped at the base of the pedestal, staring up at the orb. This is it, he said softly. This is where it belongs. Alexei looked around nervously, his rifle still raised. And what happens when you put it back? Does the zone let us walk out of here alive? Dmitri didn't answer. He stepped forward, the artifact's glow intensifying as he raised it toward the orb. The shadows around them stilled, their movement ceasing as they watched. The air grew colder, and the pulsing hum reached a crescendo, vibrating through their bodies. As Dmitri placed the artifact onto the pedestal, the orb flared brightly, blinding them with its intensity. A wave of energy surged outward, rippling through the strange landscape and sending the shadows scattering like smoke. Dmitri and Alexei were thrown to the ground, shielding their eyes from the light. When the light dimmed, the orb's glow had softened, its energy stabilizing into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The artifact had fused seamlessly into the pedestal, its strange symbols glowing faintly. The oppressive tension in the air lifted, replaced by a calm, almost serene stillness. Dmitri sat up, his chest heaving. It's done. The balance is restored. Alexei groaned, pulling himself to his feet. Great. Now how do we get out of here? As if in response, a shimmering portal appeared in front of them, identical to the one they had entered through. The crystalline formations around them began to crack and dissolve, the strange terrain collapsing in on itself. The zone was resetting, repairing the damage they had caused. We don't have much time, Dmitri said, helping Alexei to his feet. Let's go. They sprinted toward the portal, the ground crumbling behind them. The hum of the orb grew louder, not in anger but in a steady, harmonious rhythm, as though the zone were singing its approval. As they passed through the portal, the alien landscape dissolved into darkness, and they felt themselves pulled back into the familiar reality of the zone. They stumbled out of the pool building, collapsing onto the cracked pavement outside. The air was cool and fresh, the oppressive energy that had filled the area completely gone. The Geiger counter was silent, and for the first time, the zone felt quiet. Alexei sat up, rubbing his temples. I can't believe we're alive. Dmitri laughed weakly. The zone let us live because we fixed what we broke. We didn't take anything, and we didn't fight it. Alexei shot him a look. Let's not test our luck by sticking around. They gathered their gear and began the long trek back to their camp, the weight of their experience settling over them. As they walked, Dmitri couldn't help but glance back at Pripyat, the city now bathed in a soft, golden light as the sun broke through the clouds. The zone had shown them its secrets, and they had survived. But Dmitri knew this wasn't the end. The zone wasn't just a place, it was alive, constantly shifting, testing, and balancing. And though they had made it out this time, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with them yet. Part 4. The journey back to the perimeter of the zone was quiet, but the tension between Dmitri and Alexei was palpable. The weight of what they had seen and done in the heart of the zone lingered like a shadow, pressing down on their thoughts. The eerie quiet of the zone seemed heavier now, less a void and more presence watching their every step. When they reached their camp, they sat in silence, the flickering firelight casting long shadows on the ground. Dmitri poked at the embers with a stick, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The orb, the artifact, the shadowy guardians, everything they had encountered seemed part of a larger purpose, one they barely understood. Alexei broke the silence. Do you think it's over? That whatever we set right will stay that way? Dmitri glanced at him, the firelight reflecting in his tired eyes. The zone isn't something you can predict. It's alive, in a way. We didn't fix it, we just restored what was broken. Alexei snorted, leaning back against a rock. Well, I don't plan on breaking anything else. That place, it wasn't meant for people like us. Dmitri nodded, though a small part of him felt drawn to the zone's mysteries. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also beautiful in its own way, a place where the rules of reality bent and twisted, revealing glimpses of something greater. He knew Alexei was right, though. The zone demanded respect, and any mistake could be fatal. As the days passed, the two prepared to leave the zone for good. They packed their gear, dismantled their camp, and planned their route back to the perimeter checkpoint. The zone felt calmer now, its usual unease replaced by a strange, almost peaceful stillness. The anomalies were fewer, the air less oppressive, as if the zone itself had acknowledged their efforts. Their trek to the checkpoint was uneventful, the silence punctuated only by the occasional call of distant wildlife. When they finally reached the edge of the zone, the rusting barbed wire and watchtowers of the perimeter came into view. Beyond it lay the buffer zone, the stretch of land that separated the zone from the rest of the world. At the checkpoint, the guards eyed them suspiciously, their rifles slung over their shoulders. "You're lucky to be alive," one of them muttered as he inspected their papers. "Most who go that deep don't come back." Dmitri and Alexei exchanged a glance but said nothing. They knew the guards wouldn't believe their story, and even if they did, it wasn't something they wanted to relive just yet. After clearing the checkpoint, they boarded a battered truck heading for the nearest town. The road was bumpy, and the scent of diesel filled the air, but the familiarity of it all was a welcome contrast to the alien strangeness of the zone. They sat in the back, the landscape rolling by, their silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. When they reached town, they parted ways, Alexei to his small apartment on the outskirts and Dmitri to a rundown inn where he rented a room. They promised to keep in touch, though both knew it might be a while before they could talk about what had happened. Days turned into weeks, and life outside the zone slowly began to feel normal again. Dmitri took on odd jobs, trying to save up enough to move somewhere far from the zone's reach. But at night, when the world was quiet, his mind wandered back to the glowing orb, the shadowy figures, and the feeling of being on the edge of something vast and unknowable. One evening, as he sat by his window, staring out at the empty street below, a faint hum caught his attention. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. He froze, his heart racing. The sound was identical to the one they had heard in the zone, the low, rhythmic vibration that had marked the presence of anomalies. He leaned closer to the window, scanning the street for any sign of movement, but it was empty. The hum faded, leaving only silence, but the unease lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that the zone wasn't done with him, that its reach extended farther than anyone realized. The next morning, Dmitri received a package. It was unmarked, the paper wrapping worn and frayed, as if it had traveled a long way to reach him. Inside was a single object, a small shard of crystal, its surface shimmering with faint, otherworldly light. Alongside it was a note, scrawled in an unfamiliar hand. "The zone never forgets." Dmitri stared at the shard, his mind racing. Was it a warning? A message? Or something else entirely? He didn't know, but one thing was clear, the zone's mysteries were far from over. And though he had left its borders, a part of him knew he would never truly leave it behind. For now, he tucked the shard away, vowing to uncover its secrets when the time was right. Until then, he would wait, watching and listening, knowing that the zone's call was something he could never fully escape. And as he sat alone in his room, the faint hum returned, a reminder that the zone was always watching. The quarantine zone surrounding Fokovinsk power station was shrouded in mystery. Once a hub of Soviet engineering, it now lay abandoned, its silence broken only by whispers of strange lights and lost souls. Few dared to enter, but those who did were forever changed. Part 1. The ruins of Fokovin's power station stood like a monolith against the gray sky, its crumbling smokestacks piercing through the mist. Rust streaked the walls, and twisted metal beams jutted out like skeletal remains. Mikhail adjusted his backpack, glancing at the chain-link fence separating him from the entrance. Beside him, Andrei lit a cigarette, the flame flickering in the damp air. "You sure about this?" Andrei asked, exhaling a plume of smoke. "The stories alone are enough to make most people think twice." Mikhail nodded, gripping the wire cutters in his hand. "We've been preparing for weeks. There's something here, Andrei, something worth finding." Andrei rolled his eyes. "Yeah, or something worth getting killed over. You hear what happened to the last group that went in? Never came out." "That's why we're smarter," Mikhail replied, cutting through the fence with practiced precision. "We're not just wandering in blind. We've got maps, gear, and a plan." The fence gave way with a soft metallic groan, and they slipped inside, their boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The air within the zone was heavy, charged with a strange energy that made their skin prickle. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant creak of metal swaying in the wind. Their goal was simple, or so they thought. Rumors of an anomaly deep within the station had been circulating among stalkers for months. It was said to emit a strange light, almost hypnotic, and those who approached it claimed to hear voices whispering promises of knowledge, power, or salvation. Mikhail wasn't sure he believed the tales, but he couldn't ignore the pull of the unknown. As they approached the main building, the hum of a Geiger counter ticked softly, a reminder of the ever-present radiation. The station's entrance was partially collapsed, but they managed to squeeze through a gap, stepping into the dark, cavernous interior. The inside of the station was even more desolate than they had expected. Rusted machinery lay in heaps, and pools of stagnant water reflected the faint glow of their flashlights. The air was damp, carrying a metallic tang that clung to their lungs. "Feels like the place is watching us," Andrei muttered, his voice barely audible. Mikhail didn't respond, but he felt it too, a strange pressure, as if the walls themselves were alive, their silence pregnant with secrets. They followed the map, navigating through narrow corridors and cavernous turbine halls. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to change. It grew colder, and their breath fogged in the beams of their flashlights. Strange symbols began to appear on the walls, patterns etched into the rusted surfaces, glowing faintly. Andrei stopped, running his fingers over one of the symbols. This isn't just graffiti. These marks are precise. Ritualistic. "Keep moving," Mikhail said, though his voice wavered. The symbols felt wrong, like they didn't belong in the realm of the living. As they pressed on, the ticking of the Geiger counter grew faster, more insistent. They turned a corner and found themselves in a massive chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. At the center stood a strange structure, an orb of twisted metal and glass, suspended above the ground by beams of blackened steel. The air around it shimmered, bending the light like heat waves, and a low hum emanated from within. Mikhail stared in awe. This has to be it. The anomaly. Andrei took a step back, his grip tightening on his rifle. This doesn't feel right. That thing, it's alive. As they approached the anomaly, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor. The light within the orb pulsed rhythmically, casting shifting shadows across the chamber. Mikhail felt a strange pull, an almost magnetic force that drew him closer. But before he could touch it, a voice echoed through the chamber, soft, mournful, and unmistakably human. "Why, have you come?" Both men froze, their eyes darting around the room. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in their minds rather than their ears. Andrei raised his rifle, his knuckles white. "Who's there? Show yourself." The shadows shifted, coalescing into a figure at the edge of the chamber. It was humanoid, but its form flickered, as if caught between dimensions. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its presence filled the room with a sense of both sorrow and menace. "Leave this place," the figure said, its voice layered with echoes. "The station does not forgive." Mikhail stepped forward, his fear overridden by curiosity. "Who are you? What is this place?" The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes locking onto him. We are what remains, bound to the station, to its sins. You seek answers, but you will find only pain. Andre grabbed Mikhail's arm, his voice trembling. We need to go. Now. But Mikhail shook him off, taking another step toward the anomaly. The figure's form flickered violently, and the hum of the orb grew deafening. The air around them warped, and a sudden wave of energy knocked them both to the ground. When Mikhail looked up, the figure was gone, but the anomaly pulsed brighter, its light casting the chamber in stark relief. The symbols on the walls glowed in response, their patterns shifting as though alive. Andre scrambled to his feet, pulling Mikhail up with him. We're leaving, he said, his voice firm. You can stay here and get yourself killed if you want, but I'm not dying in this place. Reluctantly, Mikhail nodded, his gaze lingering on the anomaly as they turned to leave. The chamber seemed to groan in protest, the light dimming as they retreated. The hum followed them down the corridors, growing fainter with each step, but the feeling of being watched never left them. As they emerged into the cold, misty air outside, Andre turned to Mikhail, his expression grim. Whatever's in there, it doesn't want us to understand. And I'm not going back to find out. Mikhail said nothing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter was just the beginning. The zone around Fokovin's power station had secrets that called to him even now. Part 2. The journey back to their makeshift camp outside the perimeter of Fokovin's power station was a tense one. The silence between Mikhail and Andre spoke louder than words, each man lost in his thoughts about what they had just witnessed. The anomaly, the voice, and the shadowy figure had shaken them both to their core. By the time they reached their camp, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows over the surrounding forest. Andre dropped his gear onto the ground, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. That place, he muttered, exhaling smoke. It's alive, Mikhail. I'm sure of it. Mikhail sat down heavily on an overturned crate, his mind still racing. If it's alive, then it's trying to communicate. That thing, the anomaly, it's not random. It's connected to everything in that station. Andre shook his head. And you want to go back, don't you? You're insane. Mikhail didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out a notebook from his bag, flipping through pages of notes he had been compiling since their first reconnaissance of the zone. There's a pattern, he said finally. The symbols on the walls, the way the anomaly reacts, they're not just decoration. It's like a language. Andre laughed bitterly. A language? It told us to leave, Mikhail. That's all the communication I need. Mikhail ignored him, tracing one of the symbols he had sketched earlier. But what if it's not just a warning? What if it's trying to tell us something else? Something important? Andre stubbed out his cigarette, his frustration evident. I don't care what it's trying to say. The zone kills people, Mikhail. I'm not going to be another name on its list. Mikhail looked up at him, his eyes filled with determination. If we don't figure this out, someone else will come, and they might not be as careful as us. Whatever's in that station, it's bigger than you or me. We can't just walk away. Andre stared at him for a long moment before throwing up his hands. Fine. But if we go back, we do it on my terms. No rushing in, no getting too close. And the second it feels like we're not in control, we leave. Mikhail nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. Agreed. They spent the next day preparing, gathering supplies and reviewing their plan. Mikhail studied his notes obsessively, cross-referencing them with maps of the power station and other stalkers' accounts of anomalies in the area. The symbols, he believed, were key to understanding the anomaly's purpose. When night fell, they set out again, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they retraced their steps to the station. The air grew colder as they approached, and the familiar hum returned, faint at first but growing louder with each step. By the time they reached the main chamber, the anomaly's glow was visible, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Let's make this quick, Andre muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. The less time we spend here, the better. As they stepped into the chamber, the light from the anomaly intensified, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The symbols etched into the metal seemed to shift under the glow, their patterns becoming more complex. Mikhail approached one of the walls, running his fingers over the grooves. "It's reacting to the anomaly," he said, his voice filled with awe. "It's like the symbols are alive." Andre scanned the room nervously, his eyes darting to every corner. "Alive or not, we don't belong here. Just figure out what you need and let's get out." Mikhail pulled out his notebook, comparing the symbols on the wall to his sketches. As he worked, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor and walls. The air around them seemed to thicken, and a faint glow began to emanate from the symbols, spreading across the room like veins of light. "Dima," Andrei's voice was strained. "Something's happening." Before Mikhail could respond, the shadowy figure from their last visit appeared near the center of the chamber, its form more defined this time. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, and the hum shifted into a low, resonant tone that seemed to penetrate their very bones. "You return," the figure said, its voice layered with echoes. "Why?" Mikhail stepped forward, his fear overridden by his need for answers. "We want to understand. What is this place? What are you?" The figure tilted its head, its movements fluid and unnatural. "We are the remains. Fragments of what was, and what will be." Andre raised his rifle, his hand shaking. "What does that mean?" "Fragments of what?" The figure turned its gaze to Andre, its eyes narrowing. "You seek knowledge, yet bring destruction. The station remembers your kind." Mikhail glanced at Andre, motioning for him to lower the rifle. "We're not here to destroy anything. We just want to understand what's happening here." The figure's form flickered, and the light from the anomaly pulsed brighter. The station was a place of power, of ambition. But it fell to ruin, consumed by its own creation. Now, it is a prison. Mikhail's breath caught in his throat. A prison for what? The figure stepped closer, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the chamber. "For us. For those who remain. The station binds us, holds us in its grasp. You awakened it. Now, it demands balance." Andre took a step back, his voice trembling. "What kind of balance?" The figure pointed to the anomaly, its movements slow and deliberate. "It must be restored. Return the heart, or face the consequence." Mikhail's eyes widened. "The heart? What is it? Where can we find it?" The figure's form began to dissolve, its voice echoing as it faded into the shadows. "The core, below. Restore it, or the station will consume all." As the figure disappeared, the chamber fell silent, the anomaly's glow dimming slightly. Andre turned to Mikhail, his face pale. "This is insane. It's talking about some kind of core, like the heart of the station. We don't even know what it is, let alone how to restore it." Mikhail clenched his fists, his mind racing. "We have to try. If we don't, the zone could collapse, or worse." Andre shook his head, his fear evident. "This place is a graveyard, Mikhail. And if we're not careful, it's going to bury us too." Despite his words, Andre followed as Mikhail turned toward the deeper corridors of the station, their path illuminated by the faint glow of the anomaly. They were venturing into the unknown, guided only by the cryptic warnings of a shadowy figure. The zone was alive, and it wasn't done with them yet. Part 3. The corridor leading deeper into the station was narrow, with corroded walls that seemed to close in on them the farther they went. Every step echoed, the sound swallowed by the oppressive hum that grew louder the closer they got to the station's core. The air felt heavy, charged with energy, as if the entire structure were alive and watching. "Dima," Andre said, his voice hushed. "If this is the core, it's going to be worse than anything we've seen so far." Mikhail glanced back at him, his expression resolute. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now." Andre sighed, tightening his grip on his rifle. "I hope you know what you're doing." The corridor opened into a vast chamber, its scale impossible to comprehend at first glance. The ceiling disappeared into darkness, and the walls were lined with more of the glowing symbols, their patterns shifting and pulsing in time with the hum. At the center of the chamber was a massive machine, rusted, ancient, and yet somehow still alive. It towered over them, its mechanical limbs tangled like a metal spider, and at its heart was a glowing orb, pulsating with an unnatural light. "This must be it," Mikhail said, his voice barely audible. "The core." Andrei looked around, his nerves fraying with every second. "If that's the heart, how do we restore it? And what happens if we fail?" Mikhail didn't answer immediately. Instead, he approached the machine, his boots crunching on the debris-strewn floor. As he got closer, the light from the core intensified, and the symbols on the walls began to shift faster, their glow growing brighter. Suddenly, the hum stopped, replaced by eerie silence. The change was so abrupt that both men froze, their breath catching in their throats. The air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. And then, the shadowy figure appeared once more, its form more defined than ever. It stepped out from the base of the machine, its glowing eyes fixed on Mikhail. "You seek to restore balance," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the chamber. "But the cost will be great." Mikhail stood his ground, though his heart was pounding. "Tell us what we need to do." The figure gestured toward the core. "The heart is fractured. You must unite its pieces, or the station will collapse, taking all within its reach." Andrei's eyes widened. "What pieces? Where are they?" The figure's form flickered, and its voice grew softer, almost mournful. "The station scattered them to protect itself. But now it hungers. The pieces must return." As it spoke, the symbols on the walls shifted, creating a map of sorts. 3 distinct locations glowed brighter than the others, marking where the fragments of the core could be found. "This is insane," Andrei muttered. "We're supposed to split up and search this place for pieces of a glowing orb? It's suicide." Mikhail studied the map, memorizing the locations. "We don't have a choice. If we leave without fixing this, the zone won't let us go." The shadowy figure stepped closer, its glowing eyes locking onto Mikhail. "The zone will demand its price, no matter your choice. Restore the heart, and you may yet survive." Without another word, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving the 2 men alone in the chamber. The hum returned, louder now, as if the machine itself were urging them forward. Andrei shook his head, his voice tinged with fear. "You realize this is a trap, right? We're being led like rats through a maze." Mikhail turned to him, his expression firm. "Maybe. But if we don't try, we're already dead." They split up, each taking a separate corridor that led toward one of the marked locations. Mikhail's path was dark and winding, the air growing colder with every step. His flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls. The symbols seemed to watch him, their glow shifting as he moved. After what felt like an eternity, he reached a small, circular chamber. At its center was a pedestal, and atop it rested a fragment of the core. It was a shard of glowing crystal, its surface smooth and warm to the touch. As he reached for it, the air around him shimmered, and a low growl echoed through the room. Mikhail froze, his heart racing. The shadows at the edge of the chamber began to shift, coalescing into a form that was both humanoid and monstrous. It stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, its eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the core. "You," it hissed, its voice filled with venom. "You would disturb the balance?" Mikhail backed away slowly, the fragment clutched tightly in his hand. "I'm trying to restore it." The creature snarled, lunging toward him. Mikhail ducked, narrowly avoiding its clawed hand. He scrambled toward the exit, the shard pulsing in his grip. The creature followed, its growls echoing through the corridor. Meanwhile, Andrei's search led him to a flooded turbine hall. The fragment floated in the center of a pool, suspended above the water by a faint glow. As he waded toward it, ripples spread across the surface, and a faint whisper filled the air. "Turn back." Andrei hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But the thought of leaving Mikhail alone to face the zone's wrath pushed him forward. He grabbed the fragment, and the whisper turned into a deafening roar. The water churned, and a figure emerged, a mass of shadows and water, its form ever shifting. "Leave, or be consumed," it intoned, its voice shaking the walls. Andre raised his rifle, firing a warning shot into the air. "Not today." The creature lunged, but Andre ducked to the side, scrambling back toward the corridor. He could feel the fragment pulsing in his hand, its energy burning through his glove. Both men returned to the central chamber at the same time, their breaths ragged. The fragments in their hands glowed brightly, resonating with the core. The machine roared to life, its limbs shifting as if awakening from a long slumber. "There's one more piece," Mikhail said, his voice hoarse. "We have to finish this." Andre nodded, his fear tempered by determination. "Let's end it." Together, they turned toward the final marked location, the hum of the core echoing in their ears. The zone's grip tightened around them, but they pressed on, knowing there was no turning back. Part 4. The final path led deeper into the bowels of the station, where the air felt thicker, heavy with the scent of rust and decay. The hum of the core echoed faintly through the walls, its rhythm steady and unyielding, like the heartbeat of the zone itself. Mikhail and Andre moved cautiously, their flashlights flickering in the oppressive darkness. "This place feels different," Andre muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. "Like it's alive." "It is," Mikhail replied, his voice steady but strained. "The zone is reacting to us. It knows we're close." The corridor opened into a cavernous hall, its walls lined with machinery that had long since fallen into disrepair. Pipes snaked across the floor, and pools of stagnant water reflected the faint glow of the symbols etched into the walls. At the center of the hall was a raised platform, and on it rested the final fragment of the core. The fragment glowed brighter than the others, its light pulsing in time with the hum of the core. But the air around it shimmered, and shadows danced at the edges of the hall, shifting and twisting like living things. "That's it," Mikhail said, his voice tinged with awe. "The last piece." Andre scanned the room, his eyes narrowing. "It's not going to be that easy." As if in response, the shadows coalesced into a massive form, a towering figure made of darkness and light, its movements slow and deliberate. Its hollow eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the core, and its voice filled the room, layered with echoes. "You cannot restore what is broken," it said, its tone both mournful and menacing. "The balance is fragile. Your presence threatens it." Mikhail stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We're here to fix it. To restore the core and leave." The figure tilted its head, its form flickering. "The station remembers your kind. It remembers the ruin you bring." "We're not here to destroy anything," Mikhail insisted. "We're trying to undo the damage." The figure's voice grew colder. "The zone demands balance. A price must be paid." Andre raised his rifle, his fear giving way to frustration. "What kind of price?" "We've done everything you asked." The figure turned its gaze to Andre, its eyes narrowing. "A life. To restore the core, the zone must take what it is owed." Mikhail froze, his mind racing. "What do you mean? Whose life?" The figure stepped closer, its shadow stretching across the hall. "One must remain. To carry the burden. To hold the balance." Andre's face paled, but he stepped forward, his jaw set. "You're saying one of us has to stay behind?" The figure didn't answer, but its silence spoke volumes. Mikhail felt his chest tighten, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "I'll do it," Mikhail said quietly. "I'll stay." Andre turned to him, his eyes wide. "No, Dima. You can't. We'll find another way." "There is no other way," Mikhail replied, his voice firm. "The zone won't let us go unless the balance is restored." Andre clenched his fists, his expression torn between anger and sorrow. "You've always been the stubborn one." Mikhail managed a faint smile. "And you've always been the smart one. You'll make it out of here." Before Andre could protest further, Mikhail stepped onto the platform, the final fragment in his hands. The shadows around the hall seemed to pulse, the air growing colder as he approached the glowing pedestal. The figure watched in silence as Mikhail placed the fragment onto the pedestal. The light from the core flared brightly, and a wave of energy surged through the hall, shaking the walls and scattering the shadows. The symbols on the walls glowed fiercely, their patterns shifting and aligning as the machine roared to life. The hum grew deafening, vibrating through the air, and the core began to spin, its light stabilizing into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The energy in the room shifted, the oppressive weight lifting as the balance was restored. The shadowy figure stepped back, its form dissolving into the light. The zone accepts your offering. The balance is preserved. Mikhail turned to Andre, his face calm despite the chaos around him. Go. The zone won't hold you now. Andre hesitated, his hands trembling. I can't leave you here. You have to, Mikhail said, his voice steady. Tell them what we found. Make sure no one else makes the same mistakes. Andre's eyes burned with unshed tears, but he nodded, knowing there was no other choice. He turned and ran, the corridor trembling as the station began to shift around him. The light from the core illuminated his path, guiding him back to the surface. When he emerged into the cold night air, the silence of the zone felt heavier than ever. He looked back at the station, its crumbling facade bathed in an otherworldly glow. The hum of the core was faint but steady, a reminder of the balance that had been restored. Andre fell to his knees, his chest heaving as he struggled to process what had happened. He had made it out, but at a cost he would carry for the rest of his life. The zone was quiet now, its mysteries deeper than ever. But somewhere within its heart, Mikhail remained, a part of the balance, a guardian of the fragile peace they had fought to restore. And though the zone would never let him leave, Andre knew his friend had found a purpose greater than either of them could have imagined. For the first time in years, the zone felt at rest, its whispers silenced, its shadows stilled. But Andre knew that its secrets would never truly fade, and those who ventured too close would always find themselves drawn into its enigmatic embrace. Part 5. Months had passed since Andre emerged from the zone, leaving Mikhail behind to maintain the fragile balance of Volkovin's power station. The memories of that night haunted him, replaying in vivid detail whenever the world around him grew too quiet. The sound of the core's hum, the glow of the anomaly, and Mikhail's resolute face were etched into his mind, refusing to fade. Andre had returned to his modest apartment on the outskirts of Kiev, far from the zone's reach. He had tried to settle back into a normal life, taking odd jobs and spending his evenings in smoky bars, drowning his guilt in cheap vodka. But no matter how far he ran, the pull of the zone lingered, its presence a quiet shadow in the back of his thoughts. One rainy evening, as he sat by his window watching droplets race down the glass, a knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find a young woman standing there, her hair damp from the rain, clutching a worn leather satchel. She introduced herself as Yulia, a journalist who had heard rumors of his survival in the zone. I need to know what happened in Volkovinsk, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. The stories don't make sense. People say you went deeper than anyone else and came back alive. Andre hesitated, torn between wanting to protect Mikhail's sacrifice and the urge to unburden himself of the truth. Finally, he stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. Over the course of the evening, he recounted their journey, sparing no detail. Yulia listened intently, her pen scratching against the pages of her notebook. When he finished, she sat in silence for a moment before asking, "Do you believe the zone is alive?" Andre stared at her, the question stirring something deep within him. I don't know if alive is the right word, he said slowly. But it's not just a place. It's something bigger, something we can't fully understand. She nodded, closing her notebook. What happened to your friend? Mikhail? Andre's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. He stayed behind. To fix what we broke. To keep the zone in balance. Yulia looked at him with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Do you think he's still alive? Andre didn't answer immediately. He glanced out the window, his gaze distant. I don't know. But I feel like a part of him is still there, watching, guarding. The zone doesn't let go of people like him. After Yulia left, Andre sat alone in the dark, the sound of the rain blending with the faint hum that had never truly left him. He thought about the shard of crystal he had kept, a fragment of the anomaly that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light. He had hidden in a locked box under his bed, a piece of the zone that refused to let him forget. Over time, whispers of his story began to spread, drawing attention from stalkers, scientists, and adventurers alike. Some came to him seeking guidance, others chasing the promise of fame or fortune. Andre turned them all away, warning them of the dangers that awaited anyone who ventured too deep. But the zone had a way of calling to people, and he knew that its secrets would not remain buried forever. One day, someone would venture into Fokovin's power station again, drawn by the same pull that had lured him and Mikhail. And when that day came, Andre could only hope they would respect the balance his friend had given everything to protect. On a quiet morning, as Andre walked through the outskirts of town, he felt a strange warmth in his pocket. He reached in and pulled out the shard of crystal, its light glowing brighter than ever. A faint hum accompanied it, soft but unmistakable, and he stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. For a moment, he thought he heard Mikhail's voice, faint and distant, carried on the breeze. The zone never forgets. Andre smiled, a bittersweet ache filling his chest. He slipped the shard back into his pocket and continued walking, the hum fading into the quiet rhythm of his steps. Though he could never return to the zone, he knew it would always be with him, a reminder of the sacrifice, the mysteries, and the fragile balance that bound them all. And in the heart of Fokovin's power station, the core pulsed steadily, its light a beacon in the darkness, guarding the secrets of the zone until the next brave soul dared to uncover them. Part 6. Andre couldn't ignore the pull of the zone any longer. The shard he had taken from Fokovin's power station years ago had begun glowing again, its hum growing louder with every passing day. It was as if the zone itself was reaching out, calling him back. He had avoided this place for so long, but he knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had changed, and it demanded his attention. When he arrived at the edge of the zone, Andre found it eerily quiet. The perimeter fences were abandoned, the checkpoints unmanned. The zone had expanded, consuming nearby villages and leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Steeling himself, Andre stepped through the gap in the rusted chain-link fence, his flashlight piercing the growing darkness. As he ventured deeper into the zone, the air grew heavier, charged with energy. The anomalies were more frequent now, their glowing lights flickering like restless spirits in the distance. By the time he reached Fokovin's power station, the shard in his pocket was glowing brighter than ever, pulsing in rhythm with the faint hum that emanated from the station. The power station was the same yet different. The rusted machinery and crumbling walls remained, but there was a strange, almost sacred stillness to the place. The symbols etched into the walls glowed faintly, their patterns shifting as Andre passed. The zone seemed alive, watching him. As he entered the main chamber, the sight before him stopped him in his tracks. The core was fully restored, its golden light filling the room with a warm, steady glow. The machine's limbs gleamed with otherworldly energy, and at its base stood a figure. "Mikhail," Andre whispered, his voice trembling. Mikhail turned, his eyes glowing with the same golden light as the core. His form was solid yet ethereal, caught between the physical and the spiritual. He looked at Andre with a calm, knowing expression. "You came back," Mikhail said softly. Andre stepped closer, his heart pounding. "I had to. The shard, it called me." Mikhail nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "The zone needed you one last time." Andre pulled the shard from his pocket, its light intensifying in the presence of the core. "I thought it was over. I thought we restored the balance." "We did," Mikhail said. "But the zone is ever-changing. It needed one final piece to complete its transformation." Andre hesitated, staring at the shard in his hand. "If I give this back, what happens to you? To the zone?" Mikhail stepped closer, placing a hand on Andre's shoulder. "The zone will thrive. Its balance will hold. And he paused, his smile growing. "I'll finally be free." Andre's eyes widened. "Free? You mean you can leave?" Mikhail nodded. "The zone no longer needs a guardian. It has learned to sustain itself. Once the shard is returned, we can both go home." Andre felt a rush of hope and relief, mixed with disbelief. You'll come back with me?" "Yes," Mikhail said firmly. It's time. Together, they approached the core, the shard glowing brightly in Andrei's hand. The air around them shimmered, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor. As Andrei placed the shard into the core, a wave of energy surged through the chamber, scattering the shadows and illuminating the symbols on the walls. The core pulsed brighter, its golden light spreading through the room. The machine's limbs shifted, their movements slow and deliberate, as if stretching after a long sleep. The hum softened, settling into a steady, harmonious rhythm. Mikhail's form flickered, and for a moment, Andrei feared he was fading. But instead, Mikhail's body became more solid, his glow diminishing as he returned to his human form. He looked at Andrei, his eyes filled with emotion. It's done, Mikhail said, his voice steady. The zone is at peace. Andrei stepped back, his heart racing. You're really back. Mikhail smiled, the weight of years spent alone in the zone lifting from his shoulders. I am. The two men embraced, their laughter echoing through the chamber. The zone had taken so much from them, but in this moment it felt as though it had given something back. As they left the power station, the air around them felt lighter, the oppressive weight of the zone replaced by a quiet stillness. The anomalies in the distance pulsed gently, their light no longer menacing but serene. The zone was alive, but it no longer felt like a threat. When they reached the edge of the zone, Andrei turned to look back at the power station one last time. Its golden glow was faint but steady, a beacon of balance and renewal. What now? Mikhail asked, his voice filled with quiet wonder. Andrei smiled. We live. For the first time in a long time, we live. Together, they walked away from the zone, the faint hum of the core fading behind them. The zone would always be a part of them, its mysteries and dangers forever etched into their memories. But for now, they had a chance to start anew. And in the heart of Folkovin's power station, the core pulsed steadily, its light a testament to the balance restored. The zone was at peace, its whispers silenced, its shadows stilled. And for two friends who had faced its depths and survived, a new chapter awaited, a life beyond the zone, filled with hope and possibility.